Some nights don't knock politely before they change your life forever. The storm rolled across the Oregon mountains like a living thing, dragging sheets of snow through the black pine forest and rattling the windows of the isolated cabin perched near the edge of Hollow Creek Ridge. Wind clawed at the roof in long, mournful bursts, bending the old trees until they groaned like ships lost at sea. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wet firewood, gun oil, and stale coffee gone cold hours ago. A single lamp glowed beside the couch where Nathaniel Walker sat motionless, elbows on his knees, staring at a television that hadn't been turned on all night. The former silence of the room had become familiar to him over the past 8 months. Too familiar. Nate was 37 years old, active-duty Navy SEAL, broad-shouldered and hardened by years of oceans, deserts, and places no map ever truly named. But tonight he looked less like a warrior and more like a man outrunning ghosts he could never quite leave behind. His short brown hair was still damp from melted snow, his gray thermal shirt stretched tight across tired muscles, and dark circles sat beneath eyes that hadn't known real sleep in a long time. A scar cut faintly above his right eyebrow, nearly invisible beneath the dim yellow light, but the deeper wounds were the ones nobody could see, the kind that waited quietly in the dark. The kind that came alive whenever the world went silent. Outside, the wind screamed harder. Nate rubbed his hands together and stared toward the fireplace, where fading embers cracked softly beneath dying flames. He should have been asleep hours ago. Instead, he sat listening to the storm and replaying memories he never invited back. Freezing water. Radio static. A hand slipping from his grasp beneath black waves somewhere far from home. His jaw tightened. Then came the sound. Scratch. Soft at first, barely noticeable beneath the storm. Nate lifted his head slowly. Another scrape followed against the front porch wood, then a weak thud. His body reacted before his mind did. Years of training snapped instantly awake beneath exhaustion. He reached for the pistol resting on the nearby table and stood carefully, every instinct sharpening at once. The cabin creaked around him as he moved toward the door. Another scratch. Slower this time. Almost desperate. Nate unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open into a blast of frozen wind. Snow swirled violently across the porch, stinging his face and blurring the darkness beyond the railing. For a second, he saw nothing except white. Then lightning flashed somewhere behind the mountains. And there she was. A German shepherd lay collapsed beside the porch steps, nearly buried beneath drifting snow. Her sable coat was soaked and frozen in clumps against her body, her ribs barely moving beneath shallow breaths. Ice clung to her whiskers. One ear twitched weakly at the sound of the door opening, but she didn't lift her head. She couldn't. Nate froze in place, the storm roaring around him. The dog's body curled tightly inward around her swollen belly, as if every last ounce of strength she had left was being used to protect something underneath her. Pregnant. Dear God. His eyes dropped lower and his breath caught. Tiny paw prints trailed behind her through the snow before vanishing into the darkness of the forest. Not outgoing. Incoming. She had crawled here, through miles of storm and freezing mountain terrain, just to reach this porch. The shepherd opened her eyes then. Amber. Weak, but still fighting. She looked directly at him, trembling beneath the snow, and for one impossible second Nate felt something break quietly inside his chest. Not fear. Not pity. Recognition. Like two exhausted souls meeting at the exact moment neither one could carry the weight alone anymore. The shepherd collapsed the moment Nate lifted her from the porch. Snow slid from her frozen coat onto the cabin floor in heavy clumps while the wind slammed the door shut behind them hard enough to rattle the walls. For a second, neither of them moved. The dog lay near the fireplace, sides trembling violently, paws twitching weakly against the old wooden boards as warmth slowly reached her frozen body. Nate crouched beside her carefully, setting the pistol aside near the door. Up close, she looked worse than he first thought. Her fur was tangled with ice and pine needles. One rear leg dragged slightly beneath her body. Thin scratches lined her muzzle, and exhaustion hung over her like another layer of snow. But it was her eyes that held him still. They stayed fixed on him constantly, alert even through pain, like she was trying to decide whether the world had finally become safe enough to stop fighting for a few minutes. Nate grabbed an old wool blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her carefully. The shepherd flinched at first, muscles tightening beneath his hands, but she did not growl. She only looked toward her swollen stomach and released a weak breath through her nose. Protective. Even now. Nate swallowed hard. Easy, girl, he murmured softly. You made it. The words felt strange leaving his mouth. He had not spoken much in weeks unless duty required it. Silence had become easier after Latvia. Easier than hearing sympathy in people's voices. Easier than pretending he was sleeping fine. Easier than lying when someone asked if he was all right. Outside, the storm deepened across Hollow Creek Ridge. Snow hammered against the windows while tall pines bent under gusts strong enough to shake loose entire branches. The nearest town sat almost 40 miles south, and most roads were likely buried already. Nate glanced toward the dead cell phone, resting uselessly on the kitchen counter beside an untouched cup of coffee. No signal. Again, the shepherd suddenly shivered harder. Nate moved fast, pulling another log into the fireplace and striking the iron poker against burning wood until sparks floated upward in golden bursts. Heat slowly filled the cabin with the smell of cedar smoke and melting snow. The dog watched him every second. Then her body tightened sharply. A soft whine escaped her throat. Nate frowned immediately. Something was wrong. He stepped closer and carefully rested one hand near her side. Beneath the soaked fur, her stomach clenched again. Stronger this time. His training kicked in automatically. Elevated breathing, muscle tension, distress. The realization hit him instantly. Labor. No, he whispered under his breath, looking toward the storm outside. Not tonight. But the shepherd's body trembled again, and this time she cried softly through gritted exhaustion. Nate exhaled slowly and stood, running both hands over his tired face. He had spent years stopping bleeding in impossible places. Years stabilizing wounded men on moving aircraft carriers and freezing coastlines. But this was different. Smaller somehow. More fragile. He moved through the cabin gathering supplies with controlled precision. Towels. Water. Flashlights. Medical kit. Every movement felt mechanical at first, driven by habit more than emotion. Yet something unfamiliar lingered underneath it now. Something warm. Something he had not felt in longer than he wanted to admit. Purpose. The shepherd tried weakly to rise as he returned beside her, but her legs collapsed immediately beneath her weight. Nate knelt again and steadied her gently. Do not do that, he said quietly. You are safe here. Safe. The word echoed strangely in his own chest. He had not believed it himself in a very long time. The fire crackled softly beside them while snow hissed against the windows. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped beneath the weight of ice. The shepherd's breathing slowed slightly beneath the blanket. Then, very carefully, she lowered her exhausted head onto Nate's boot for the first time. The movement was so small he almost missed it. But the moment her weight settled there, something inside the cabin changed. The room no longer felt empty. The storm buried the mountain deeper into silence as midnight drifted toward dawn. Snow climbed halfway up the cabin windows now, turning the outside world into a blur of white shadows and swaying pine branches. Inside, the fire burned hotter, filling the room with a low amber glow that softened the rough edges of old furniture and military gear scattered across the walls. Nate sat cross-legged beside the shepherd with a towel draped over his shoulder and a metal bowl of warm water cooling near the fireplace. The dog had not taken her eyes off him for nearly 20 minutes. Every movement he made, she tracked carefully. Not fearful. Careful. Like trust was something she wanted desperately, but no longer knew how to give away for. Free. Nate slowly dipped the towel into the steaming water and wrung it out. I am going to help you, he said quietly. That is all. The shepherd's ears twitched weakly at the sound of his voice. He started cleaning the ice from her coat one section at a time. Melted snow darkened the wood beneath her body while small bits of frozen debris loosened from her fur. Pine needles. Mud. Thin streaks of dried blood near her hind leg. Nate frowned at that. She had traveled far in terrible shape. Too far. The storm alone should have killed her hours ago. Yet somehow she kept moving. He paused when his fingers brushed the faint outline of ribs beneath her side. Too thin. She had not eaten properly in days. Maybe longer. The realization settled heavily in his chest. This was not just a stray dog caught in bad weather. Something had happened to her before she ever reached this mountain. The shepherd suddenly released another strained whine. Her stomach tightened visibly beneath the blanket. Nate set the towel aside immediately and rested his palm gently against her abdomen. Then he felt it. Movement. Tiny and rapid beneath the muscle. One heartbeat. Then another. Then several more. His eyes lifted slightly in surprise. "Well," he whispered softly, almost to himself. "You have been carrying an entire family through this storm." For the first time, the shepherd's tense posture eased just enough for her head to lower against the blanket again. Nate leaned closer carefully, pressing 2 fingers near her side the way field medics sometimes checked faint circulation during rescue operations. Beneath the crackling fire and screaming wind outside, he could hear them faintly now. Tiny fluttering rhythms. Weak but alive. The puppies were still holding on. Nate exhaled slowly through his nose. The sound stirred something deep in his memory he wished had stayed buried. Another freezing night. Another failing heartbeat. Another body slipping away while he fought time itself with numb hands and desperate prayers he never admitted saying out loud. His jaw tightened hard enough to ache. He stood abruptly and walked toward the kitchen sink, gripping the counter edge as cold rainwater tapped softly against the metal basin from a leaking pipe overhead. For a moment he closed his eyes. Latvia came back in pieces the way it always did. Black ocean water. Floodlights cutting through freezing fog. A teammate's voice growing weaker over comms. Nate had reached for him. He had tried. But the sea had taken him anyway. Since then, sleep became something dangerous. Because every time his eyes closed, he heard the silence afterward. Behind him, the shepherd let out another small cry. Nate looked back immediately. Her breathing had become shallower now, sides rising unevenly beneath the blanket. The countdown had started whether he was ready or not. He walked back to her slowly and crouched again near the firelight. The dog watched him with exhausted amber eyes while snow hissed against the windows like static from another world. Then carefully, almost trembling, she stretched her nose toward his hand and touched it once. The gesture lasted barely a second, but it carried more trust than words ever could. Nate swallowed hard and rested his forehead briefly against hers. "All right, Luna," he whispered, giving her a name without even realizing it. "Let us get your babies through the night." The cabin lights died just after 4 in the morning. One sharp flicker. Then darkness swallowed everything except the fire. The heater groaned once before falling silent, leaving only the storm outside and the restless crackle of burning cedar logs. Nate looked toward the ceiling instinctively, while freezing wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake loose dust from the beams overhead. "Perfect timing," he muttered under his breath. Snow had completely buried the narrow road leading down the mountain by now. Even if he could reach his truck, there would be no getting through 15-foot drifts and fallen pine branches before sunrise. The storm had cut the cabin off from the world entirely. Luna cried out suddenly behind him. Nate turned fast. Her body tightened sharply beneath the blankets, muscles trembling with another contraction that lasted longer this time. He crossed the room immediately and dropped beside her near the firelight. Sweat dampened the fur around her neck despite the cold air creeping through the cabin walls. Her breathing had become shallow and uneven, chest rising too quickly now. Nate reached for the flashlight resting nearby and checked her carefully with steady hands. The old combat medic instincts returned piece by piece. Stay calm. Control the room. One step at a time. But beneath the discipline, he could feel tension crawling slowly into his chest. This was no longer a rescue. It was survival. The storm screamed outside while Nate spread clean towels beside the fireplace and pulled a cast iron kettle closer to the flames. Water steamed softly into the air, mixing with the scent of smoke and wet fur. Luna watched him constantly between painful breaths. Every now and then her ears twitched toward the windows as if she still feared something might follow her out of the forest. Nate noticed it. "Nobody is coming up this mountain tonight," he said quietly. "You are safe here." The words sounded steadier than he felt. Another contraction hit hard enough to make Luna whimper through clenched exhaustion. Nate knelt beside her immediately, one hand resting gently near her shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. "Stay with me." Her body trembled violently beneath his touch. Then suddenly the entire cabin went silent in a way that felt unnatural. The wind outside eased for just a second, and in that stillness Nate heard it clearly. A tiny sound. Weak. Fragile. A faint heartbeat slowing beneath the strain. His pulse quickened. Come on, he breathed softly. Not yet. Minutes stretched painfully. The fire popped and hissed while snow pressed harder against the windows. Luna strained again, claws scraping lightly against the blanket. Nate stayed beside her through every second of it, talking softly even when he did not know what else to say. Maybe the words were more for himself than her. You keep fighting. Another breath. You came too far to quit now. Then finally it happened. A tiny puppy slipped into Nate's trembling hands near the edge of the blanket. Small, motionless, too still. The room froze around him. Luna lifted her head weakly, exhausted amber eyes searching his face while the firelight flickered across the tiny body cradled in his palms. Nate's throat tightened instantly. No movement. No sound. Memories crashed into him without warning. Cold water. Blue lips. A teammate's heartbeat fading beneath his fingers while alarms screamed somewhere far away. His breathing sharpened. Not again. He grabbed a towel quickly and began rubbing the tiny puppy carefully, warming it with practiced hands that suddenly did not feel steady anymore. Come on, he whispered hoarsely. Come on, little guy. Nothing. Luna released a soft, broken cry beside him. Nate swallowed hard and pressed 2 fingers gently against the puppy's chest. Faint. Barely there. But something. Hope. He leaned closer, wrapping the tiny body carefully in warmth from the towel, while snow hammered the cabin roof overhead like distant drums. You hear me, he whispered. You are not dying tonight. The tiny body fit entirely inside Nate's hands. Warm towels surrounded the puppy while firelight danced across damp black for no larger than his palm. Still nothing. No cry. No movement. Just silence heavy enough to pull the air from the room. Nate rubbed the puppy carefully, trying to bring warmth back into the fragile little body, while Luna watched from the blanket beside him with exhausted eyes that barely stayed open anymore. Snow slammed against the cabin windows in sudden bursts, and somewhere outside a pine tree cracked beneath the weight of ice with a sound like distant thunder. Nate barely heard it. His focus narrowed completely to the tiny heartbeat fading beneath his fingertips. Come on, he whispered again, voice rough now. Stay here. The puppy's chest fluttered once beneath the towel. Weak, then still again. Fear crept into Nate's throat before he could stop it. Real fear. The kind he hated most because it carried memory with it. Another freezing night. Another life slipping away in his hands while he fought helplessly against time. His breathing sharpened as flashes pushed into his mind without permission. Black ocean waves crashing against steel. Frozen rain hitting his face. A teammate drifting unconscious beneath floodlights while Nate screamed his name into the storm. He had tried everything that night. Everything. But some people still disappeared no matter how tightly you held on to them. Nate squeezed his eyes shut hard for 1 second. Then he forced himself back into the room. Back to the fire. Back to the tiny life trembling in his palms. No, he muttered firmly, almost angry now. Not this time. He adjusted the towel and leaned closer, shielding the puppy from the cold draft creeping beneath the cabin door. His large hands shook slightly despite years of training. Luna noticed immediately. Even through pain and exhaustion, she dragged herself forward a few inches across the blanket. Her breathing remained shallow, but her amber eyes stayed locked on him with something deeper than fear now. Trust. Complete and terrible trust. Nate swallowed hard. Then suddenly the puppy twitched. Small, barely visible, but real. Nate froze instantly. Another twitch followed beneath the towel. Tiny paws curled weakly against his fingers. That is it. Nate breathed softly, hope cracking into his voice for the first time in months. Come on, little guy. He rubbed the puppy gently once more. A second passed, then another, and finally a tiny broken cry escaped into the cabin air. Thin, weak, beautiful. Luna lifted her head immediately at the sound. Her exhausted body trembled while the puppy released another faint squeak against the towel. Nate let out a breath so shaky it almost sounded like a laugh. Outside, the storm still raged through the mountains, but inside the cabin something shifted quietly. The silence no longer felt empty. Nate carefully lowered the puppy beside Luna near the warmth of the fire. Instantly, the shepherd stretched forward despite her exhaustion, licking the tiny newborn with slow, protective movements. Then she paused unexpectedly and looked back toward Nate. The firelight reflected softly in her tired amber eyes while snow drifted endlessly against the dark windows behind them. For a moment, neither moved. Then Luna rested her head gently against Nate's arm. The simple weight of it hit harder than he expected. No fear. No hesitation. Gratitude. Nate looked down at the trembling puppy curled safely against its mother and felt something unfamiliar loosen quietly inside his chest. Not relief exactly. Something softer. Like the frozen part of him that had survived for months without truly living had finally begun to thaw beside that fire. By sunrise, the storm had softened into a slow gray snowfall, drifting quietly across Hollow Creek Ridge. The world outside the cabin looked buried and distant, wrapped beneath layers of untouched white that stretched endlessly through the pine forest. Inside, the fire still burned low and warm, while soft newborn sounds filled the room for the first time in months. 2 more puppies had arrived during the night. Tiny, fragile, alive. They lay pressed close against Luna beneath thick blankets near the fireplace, their small bodies rising and falling with uneven breaths while she watched over them with tired but steady eyes. Nate sat nearby against the couch, exhaustion pulling heavily at his shoulders. His thermal shirt was stained with soot and melted snow, and his hands still smelled faintly of cedar smoke and antiseptic from the medical kit spread across the floor. He had not slept at all, but for once, the exhaustion felt different. Cleaner somehow. The kind that came after protecting something instead of surviving it. One of the puppies released a weak squeak and crawled clumsily across the blanket toward warmth. Nate watched it quietly. Tiny paws. Closed eyes. A life so small it could fit inside one hand. Luna lifted her head immediately and pulled the puppy gently back beside her chest with careful movements that seemed almost human in their tenderness. Nate felt his throat tighten unexpectedly at the sight. He looked away toward the frosted windows. Morning light slipped faintly through the snow-covered glass, pale and cold against the dark wooden walls of the cabin. The room smelled of wet fur, coffee grounds, smoke, and something softer now. Life. Real life. Not memories. Not ghosts. His gaze drifted toward the framed photograph sitting crooked beside the fireplace mantel. 4 men standing shoulder to shoulder in dark water gear beneath a steel gray sky. Navy SEAL Team 7. Nate stared at the younger version of himself near the center of the picture. Cleaner face. Easier smile. Beside him stood Mason Reed with one arm thrown over Nate's shoulder and salt water dripping from both their uniforms after a successful extraction exercise years before everything changed. Nate lowered his eyes slowly. "I should have gotten to you faster," he whispered under his breath. The confession barely reached the air, yet somehow Luna heard it. She lifted her head from the puppies and looked directly at him across the firelight. Nate let out a slow breath and rubbed both hands over his tired face. "He trusted me," he said quietly, voice rough with sleeplessness. "And I still lost him." Outside, wind stirred lightly through the pines. Inside, only the fire answered. Nate stared at the flames for several seconds before continuing. "After that mission, everybody kept saying it was not my fault." He shook his head once. "Funny thing is, none of that mattered at 3 a.m. when the nightmare started." Luna watched him without moving. No judgment, no pity. Just quiet understanding from tired amber eyes that had clearly seen suffering too. Nate leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes briefly. He had spent months trying to outrun silence because silence always brought memory with it. But this morning felt different somehow. Softer. One of the puppies stumbled awkwardly away from the blankets and bumped directly into Nate's boot. He looked down immediately. The tiny shepherd let out a squeaky, frustrated sound before curling beside his foot for warmth. Nate stared at the little creature in disbelief for a second. Then slowly, against every instinct grief had built inside him over the past year, he smiled. Small, tired, real. Luna saw it instantly. Her tail thumped once against the blanket beside the fire. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, the shepherd finally closed her eyes and rested. 3 days passed before the mountain road reopened. By then the storm had become memory drifting from pine branches beneath pale winter sunlight, and Hollow Creek Ridge looked almost peaceful again. Smoke curled steadily from the cabin chimney each morning while fresh snow glittered untouched. Across the frozen hillsides. Inside, the silence that once filled every corner of Nate's home had disappeared completely. Tiny paws scratched across wooden floors now. Weak newborn squeaks echoed beside the fireplace. Luna followed Nate from room to room with slow, careful steps while the puppies slept bundled inside an old navy blanket near the hearth. The cabin no longer felt like a place someone hid from the world. It felt lived in again. Nate stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee when he noticed Luna watching the front window unusually hard. Her ears lifted sharply. Her body stiffened. Then came the sound. A truck engine climbing slowly through snow outside. Nate frowned and stepped toward the frosted glass. An old green pickup crawled carefully up the narrow road before stopping near the porch. A man climbed out slowly, bundled in a heavy brown coat with gray stubble covering most of his weathered face. He looked somewhere in his late 60s. Tired. Uneasy. The stranger removed his hat as he approached the porch like someone carrying guilt heavier than the cold. Luna released a low, uneasy rumble behind Nate. Not aggressive. Nervous. Nate opened the door carefully. Frozen air drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine and gasoline. The older man stopped several feet away, eyes settling immediately on Luna behind Nate's legs. His face changed the moment he saw her. Relief first, then shame. Lord above, he whispered softly. She actually made it. Nate's expression hardened slightly. You know this dog? The man nodded slowly, unable to look Luna in the eyes for more than a second. My name is Walter Grady, he said quietly. I own the cattle property about 20 miles west of here. He swallowed hard, or at least what is left of it. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped closer toward the porch railing. Wildfire tore through our land back in September. Took the barn, took the house, took near everything. His voice cracked slightly beneath the weight of the memory. My son found her wandering near the highway a few weeks ago. Pregnant, barely eating. We tried keeping her in the shed while rebuilding, but he stopped there, guilt pulling visibly at his face. Nate's jaw tightened. But what? Walter lowered his eyes. My boy thought she was too weak to survive the winter. The words hung heavily in the cold mountain air. Behind Nate, Luna lowered her head slightly beside the fireplace, quiet but alert. Walter rubbed one rough hand over his beard slowly. He drove her up these roads during the storm and left her out near the ridge. Nate stared at him in disbelief for several long seconds. Snow drifted softly between them, while anger stirred low and hot inside his chest. She walked through that storm carrying puppies, he said quietly. She almost died getting here. Walter nodded once, eyes wet now. I know. His voice barely rose above the wind. That is why I came. He reached carefully into his coat pocket and removed an old leather collar burned dark around the edges. A small metal tag hung from it, scratched and blackened by fire. Luna stood immediately the moment she saw it. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the doorway. Walter crouched down despite the cold and held out the collar with trembling hands. Her name was Luna before the fire too, he whispered. My granddaughter named her. Luna sniffed the collar once. Then, to Nate's surprise, she turned away from it and walked back inside the cabin toward the sleeping puppies beside the fire. Walter watched her go silently. A sad smile touched his face. Looks like she already decided where home is. Walter stayed only a few minutes longer before the mountain cold finally pushed him back toward his truck. He left the burned collar hanging quietly beside the cabin door and promised to return someday with his granddaughter once the roads became safer again. Nate watched the old pickup disappear slowly down the snowy ridge until nothing remained except tire tracks fading beneath fresh flakes drifting from the gray sky. Behind him, Luna lay beside the fireplace with the puppies curled tightly against her chest. The moment Nate closed the cabin door, she lifted her head and watched him carefully, almost as if she already understood the conversation that had just passed between the two men. Nate picked up the old collar from the wall hook and turned it gently in his hands. Burn marks scarred the leather deeply, but the metal tag still carried faint lettering beneath the soot. Luna. The name looked strange and beautiful somehow against the firelight. A survivor's name. He crouched beside her slowly and slipped the collar loosely around her neck again. Luna remained perfectly still during the entire moment, eyes soft and tired while the puppies squirmed quietly beneath her warmth. Nate scratched behind her ears gently once he finished. Looks like you found your way home after all, he murmured. Luna rested her head against his knee in answer. Outside, winter slowly loosened its grip over the following weeks. Snow melted from the cabin roof in steady dripping rhythms during the afternoons. Thin patches of green grass finally pushed through frozen earth near the porch steps, where Luna had nearly collapsed that first night. The puppies grew quickly too. Small, clumsy shadows racing across wooden floors and chewing everything they could reach. One constantly tugged at Nate's bootlaces. Another refused to sleep anywhere except inside his old navy jacket hanging near the fireplace. And the smallest of the litter followed him everywhere with determined little paws that clicked rapidly against the cabin floorboards. The silence that once haunted the cabin no longer existed. There was always movement now. Always life. One evening Nate sat outside on the porch wrapped in a heavy flannel jacket while pale gold sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. The air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. Somewhere deeper in the valley, a river carried snowmelt through stone with a low, peaceful rush. Luna rested beside him while the puppies tumbled across the porch between scattered pine needles and old boots left near the doorway. Nate watched them quietly for a long time. Then his phone buzzed inside his jacket pocket. The screen lit up with a military number he recognized instantly. Deployment command. He stared at it without answering at first. Months ago, the sound alone would have tightened every muscle in his body. Another mission. Another freezing coastline. Another chance to lose someone. His thumb hovered over the screen while old fear stirred faintly inside him. But before he could answer, something warm pressed gently against his hand. Luna. She looked up at him with calm amber eyes while one tiny puppy climbed clumsily onto his boot and curled there without hesitation. Nate let out a slow breath. The mountains stood quiet around them beneath fading evening light, while smoke drifted lazily from the chimney into the cold Oregon sky. For the first time since Latvia, the future did not feel like something waiting to break him. It felt uncertain, human, alive. Nate answered the phone calmly and listened for several seconds before speaking. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Then a faint smile touched his face as he looked down at Luna and the puppies gathered around his feet. "I will be ready." Spring arrived quietly on Hollow Creek Ridge. Snow retreated from the mountains inch by inch, revealing dark earth, moss-covered stones, and long stretches of pine forest shimmering beneath soft morning rain. The cabin no longer stood alone against winter silence. Life moved through it now in constant little waves. Puppy paws raced across the porch every sunrise. Small barks echoed through the trees while Luna watched over them from the old wooden steps, where she had once nearly died beneath drifting snow. Nate stood outside that same porch one early morning with a duffel bag resting near his boots and cold mountain air filling his lungs. The sky above Oregon glowed pale blue behind thin clouds, and the scent of wet cedar drifted through the valley below. Somewhere down the ridge, his truck engine warmed with a low, steady rumble. Deployment orders waited folded neatly inside the passenger seat. But this morning felt nothing like the last time he left for duty. There was no weight crushing his chest, no panic clawing at the edges of his thoughts, just the quiet ache that comes from caring about something enough to miss it. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open softly. Luna stepped outside first, her sable coat glowing warmly beneath the sunrise. The burn-marked collar rested loosely around her neck now, worn but proud. 3 nearly grown puppies tumbled after her in clumsy excitement, immediately surrounding Nate's boots with wagging tails and playful barks. The smallest one, the same puppy he thought would never breathe that stormy night, pawed insistently at his pant leg until Nate crouched down laughing quietly under his breath. "You are getting too big for this," he murmured, scratching behind the puppy's ears. The little shepherd responded by climbing halfway into his lap anyway. Nate shook his head softly, smiling in a way that once would have felt impossible. Luna approached slowly beside them and rested her head gently against his shoulder. Nate closed his eyes for a second at the warmth of her fur and the steady calm of her breathing. Months ago, he had stood in this same place convinced there was nothing left inside him worth saving. Now the porch beneath his boots carried scratches from puppy claws and muddy paw prints drying in the morning sun. The cabin windows glowed warm instead of empty. And for the first time in nearly a year, Nate no longer dreaded the silence inside his own mind. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old photograph from Latvia. The edges were worn now from weeks of carrying it everywhere. For young men beneath a gray foreign sky. Nate stared quietly at Mason Reed's smiling face, while wind moved gently through the pines around him. "I finally understand," he whispered softly. You were never asking me to save everybody. His thumb brushed lightly across the photo once before sliding it back into his pocket. Luna watched him carefully the entire time. Then she nudged his hand once more, almost as if reminding him that some wounds do not heal through forgetting, only through love returning slowly enough for the heart to trust it again. A horn sounded softly from the truck below the ridge. Time to leave. Nate stood and grabbed the duffel bag beside the porch steps. The puppy circled his legs anxiously while Luna remained still, amber eyes following him with quiet understanding. He paused halfway down the steps and looked back one final time. Morning sunlight spilled across the cabin roof. Pine trees swayed softly beyond the porch. And where death once arrived frozen beneath a storm, life now played freely beneath spring skies. Nate smiled gently. Real this time. Then he gave Luna one last nod before heading toward the truck. Behind him, she sat calmly at the edge of the porch surrounded by her puppies, watching until he disappeared beyond the mountain road. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between grief and grace, a man who thought his soul had frozen forever finally found his way home.